So anyway.
Yes.
All right, let's get started. I'll just do a quick intro and we'll just get right to it. Welcome to Corporate Law Lab. I'm Neil Taylor, host of the podcast and director of the Corporate Law Center at the Donald P. Kleekamp College of Law at the University of Cincinnati. It's a new name, but I've done it right twice, so we'll get it there. I'm joined today by our co-host, Phoebe Uttermohlen, one of our corporate law fellows who's now a 2L. Congrats, Phoebe, on surviving your first year.
Thank you.
And our guest today is Sara Vandore-Mackay, who I've worked with quite some time ago, even though she's quite young, and has had a very interesting career since we last worked together. So we'll get right to it. Welcome, Sara.
Welcome. Should I say it's Sarah?
It is Sarah.
It is Sarah.
Neil.
Well, I've been making Phoebe practice for days. I was just like, the funny thing is I was like,
should I just let that go? And then I thought,
no, we do it all day. I was saying to Phoebe that, or someone else, I was like, I'm pretty sure I called her Sarah back when we worked together, but she was since I was the GC and she was an associate, she was probably too polite to say it.
I was like, this is going to be hard for me because I used to live, my roommate for 3 years was named Sarah. And I was like, it's going to be hard to shake the Sarah habit. It is Sarah.
It is Sarah.
It is Sarah. So I normally, if I'm on like a Zoom call, it depends how long the call is. Sometimes I correct people at the start. Sometimes I'm like, I'll just leave it and say it at the end. But anyway, sorry.
Okay, we got it right. The Mackay was the one that I was more worried about.
No,
so I got that right. So we will start with, if our Cincinnati listeners will know that the first question is always where you went to high school. So you did your A-levels in Edinburgh, which is the equivalent of that question. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I grew up, born and bred in Scotland, and studied there. It's an amazingly cultural place. It's got the Edinburgh Festival and, amazing art house cinemas. So great place to grow up.
I'll bet. But then you moved to England right away for school. Why didn't you stay in Scotland? Was it the attraction to the law, or?
Scotland has a different legal regime to England. So if you qualify in Scotland, obviously it's a much smaller country. You can get dual qualification, and people have qualified in England and go to Scotland, or the other way around. But principally it was just to kind of spread my wings, and Edinburgh can feel quite a small place growing up, so it was good to kind of go somewhere else. And I went to the north of England, a big city with a big university there.
Why did you decide to study law and French?
Well, I guess I was quite clever at school, and in my school, if you were clever, they sort of put you towards either medicine or law. And my dad was actually a criminal QC. My dad was a criminal barrister, so what you call an advocate, and he was a QC, Queen's Counsel, now King's Counsel. And so I grew up, he was defending criminals, so alleged murderers and rapists, and coming home with bags full of evidence. So, and I liked the way his brain worked. We used to have kind of conversations about analyzing various things, and I found it quite interesting. So I decided to do law. And the French bit, so in the UK, you can do something called the Erasmus Network. So in your third year, if you pick a language, you can go and study abroad. And I'm glad to say they've brought that back even after Brexit. So doing law in French meant that I could spend my third year in France, which was brilliant.
And you went to Strasbourg?
Yeah, it was one of the universities that got picked for us. So I studied French law, the first year of French law in the University of Strasbourg, which was quite tough at the time. But also it was where the European Parliament is. So 1 week a month, all the politicians come from Brussels and go to Strasbourg. So I managed to get a job as an assistant to one of the MEPs there, which was great as well.
So we'll try and keep up on the acronyms. MEP is Member of European Parliament, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what was your favorite part of studying and the Strasbourg opportunity and working for the MEP? What stood out to you from, what do you remember?
So I guess it's a kind of link throughout my career, but it's just an amazing way to expand your horizon, growing up in Scotland and then being at university with other English students. So So you had people from all over Europe there. You know, my friends were Swedish and Dutch and German, and it just expanded my mind to other cultures and the way of doing things. And actually, at the time, you know, the EU was quite an interesting place to be. There were lots of opportunities, and from going to Strasbourg, I realized there were lots of opportunities as well in Brussels, which is where I went to after I graduated.
Well, yeah, so let's go there. You joined Allen Overy, but as a paralegal in the Brussels office, right?
Yeah. I wanted to go to Brussels, and I literally just looked at who was, I think it was a sort of former kind of internet search years ago. I looked at who was out, which law firms were out there, and Allen Overy was one of them. Probably it was at the start of the list. And I called up, and I spoke to a partner who I think was called David Harrison. And I had a really quick conversation with him and basically said, do you have a paralegal? No. Do you want one? And a week later, I was flying out to Brussels, and I had a job, which was fantastic. And then I didn't know a huge amount about A&O, but I obviously got to know a lot about them when I was there, which was great.
So A&O at the time, and still, although now it's A&O Sherman, was part of the Magic Circle, so the 5 biggest firms in London, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't really part of your plan. You weren't like targeting A&O and this is my way in to become an associate. It was more make a call to the guy at the top of the list, and it worked out.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, very different now, and to get a paralegal job at A&O Sherman, I imagine is very sought after and hard to get. So, you know, and I know that people do lots of kind of weekend working and work experience and everything that they can. But at the time, yeah, it was probably quite easy.
And then you worked for a while at the European Commission there in Brussels, right?
Yeah, so Brussels is obviously the epicenter of the EU, and it's an incredible place to be an expat. So probably like, you know, a lot of the centres where you have a lot of expats. So you know, everybody works in one of the institutions that's there, and you can do something called a stage or an internship at the European Commission. So I was there just before enlargement. And I worked in the enlargement unit. So we were interviewing governments in Poland and other kind of countries about their border control and their police corruption units and all that kind of stuff. So I did that for 6 months. And at the time, I wasn't really thinking about being a lawyer, to be honest, because my degree, law and French, was, as well as doing French language, I did literature and philosophy and politics. So it was a very wide degree. And at the time, I didn't know where I was going to go. I was thinking a bit about politics. But eventually, after 2 years, I thought, actually, I was going to try for a training contract and qualify.
So that's when you joined A&O proper as an associate. And then, so I guess let's maybe try and demystify it a bit. So having an undergrad degree in law, then you're joining this massive firm and on a training contract. So you're not actually a qualified solicitor yet at that point, right?
No, so actually I missed out one stage in the middle, which you do a legal LPC, legal practice certificate. So you do your undergraduate degree, which is typically 3 years. Mine was 4 because I went to France for my 3rd year. And then you do an LPC, which is like a one year course, which just teaches you all the sort of practical bits of being a lawyer. And then you do a training contract, which is 2 years. And in A&O, you were in 4 different departments. And at the end of those 2 years, you're a qualified lawyer or a qualified solicitor.
Got it. And so one of the departments you must have, so when we met, you were in the international commercial arbitration space, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And then is that what you gravitated toward, or what they gravitated you into? Speaking French probably had a lot to do with it, right?
It did. Yeah, I think so. I did 4 seats. One was in banking, which was really interesting, but I knew quite quickly that wasn't going to be the area for me. And one was in corporate. One was in Prague, which was amazing, getting to know Central Europe. And one was in commercial litigation. And that was where I really enjoyed it and ended up in sort of global arbitration practice there. But definitely it was just the area I enjoyed the most and probably was best at. So.
Okay. Phoebe, could you mute your mic? I think we're getting a lot of feedback from your side. There we go. Thank you. So at that point, then you're living and working in London, right?
Yes. Yeah.
How was the adjustment to the big smoke?
Yeah, I mean, I had a great time being a trainee in there was a huge intake of us all the same age. And a lot of my friends from university had gone to London, and meanwhile, when I'd been in Brussels. So, yeah, we stayed in kind of area of London that was full of young people. It was very, very social being a trainee. It was really good fun. Yeah.
Did you enjoy the practice?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, where we met, for example, just shows the incredible experiences that you could have. So Neil was my client at the time, if I can say. And I was flying out to Dakar in Senegal at the presidential palace, meeting our other side. And I was going to Paris to meet Parisian lawyers at A&O Paris and Senegalese counsel there, going to a huge, important ICSID arbitration, but also doing various different claims. And that's, litigation was interested in that way, that you had various different projects on the go. And, one that I worked on, which went on for a very long time. But generally speaking, litigation, you're kind of working on it for a while. And then, maybe you're in court, which I also really enjoyed. But I also did pro bono work. And some of the people that I was working pro bono for were in the arts and theatre companies, for example. And to me, that was, I think, why I then thought about working more in the creative industries.
Great. So then you moved to Schillings, you left the magic circle, but Schillings is a pretty well-known boutique firm that does media privacy, that kind of law, right?
Right, yeah. So it's a claimant law firm, media firm. So at the time, typically you're protecting your clients, and your clients are, generally speaking, celebrities, high net worth individuals, politicians, public figures, and you're protecting them in terms of privacy and libel. So, for example, there used to be a tabloid that came out on a Sunday, and it was called The News of the World. And every Sunday it was like a big splash, and it was like, this politician caught with their trousers down, or, this celebrity party, lots and lots of footballers being caught in various affairs. And it was the summer, I always think it was the summer of the footballer super injunction. So we were always going to court to get these super injunctions, which kind of, the whole process kind of blew up because there was a footballer called Ryan Giggs where it just all came out. Yeah. And so those stopped working. But at the time you could get an injunction over publication, but also over the fact that there had been an injunction. So it was all kind of completely secret. So I was in court a lot. It was all very quick. We'd hear of a news story. You had to review what the story was. You had to respond very quickly. And then if it was published, you had to act very, very quickly. So it was a really exciting, fun place to work, and really lovely lawyers and good clients as well.
And that was, News of the World went away in the phone hacking scandal, if I remember right.
Yeah. I mean, as we all know now, and there's various court cases rumbling on, there were a lot of practices that were being used that were deeply unethical at the time. And, I think we've moved on a lot in terms of privacy. You just wouldn't have the same articles that they had at those times. They were bugging people's phones, all sorts of kind of private detectives and, secret kind of stalking of celebrities that went on. And I think that's all sort of come out now, but it's, very different environment. You wouldn't have that same sort of reporting nowadays.
Yeah, and it was go ahead.
For my mic feedback, what year was that?
It was sort of around 2010, 2011.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's been a number of prosecutions that have taken place and civil claims in relation to the people who were victims of that sort of hacking. And it wasn't just celebrities, it was, there were families of victims of murder tragedies where they were, trying to find out information. So, I mean, effectively things are very different now.
Yeah, and you had, and it was early in the days of smartphones.
Yeah.
So you had celebrities whose password to get into their phone was 1234.
Yeah.
So they didn't make it too terribly hard to hack into their messages.
Yeah, and I guess it was at the time that people were leaving voicemails, which I think we've all kind of stopped doing that now. So they were kind of, going into people's voicemails and listening to voicemails. So, all deeply unethical.
So how much did the corporate litigation and arbitration work you'd done before that prepare you for what you ended up doing in media law?
I think litigation is a brilliant thing to have in your back pocket that you know, because every time you're working with a client, you're always thinking, what's the worst case scenario? You know, that's my job now, is what's the risk? You know, are you going to be sued effectively? How can I navigate this film or this TV program to make sure you're not going to end up in court, whether that's libel or privacy or contempt, for example? And as a former litigator, you know what kind of correspondence is going to come in if you get a complaint. You know how to reply to that sort of correspondence to try and get it out of the court. If it does go to court, you're not going to panic. You've done it before. You've worked with barristers, you know what barristers need. And in the back of my mind always is, whether it's drafting someone's production protocols or just advising the client on dealing with a contributor complaint, you're always thinking, what's the main risk? What's your evidence? How can you take contemporaneous notes of what you're doing so that if you do end up getting sued and you have to disclose all this stuff, what do we need to evidence at the time? So it's, really helpful.
So if a student was interested in pursuing media and entertainment law, and I can tell you from the director of our externship program, many of them are.
Right.
What advice would you give to someone who's, still in law school about how to set themselves up for a career like that?
Sure. I mean, I should say as well, I flipped, obviously, from my time in Schillings, and I'm now on the other side, is what I should say. Right. So I'm now a defendant lawyer, and there's a deliberate nature to that, which was, while, there was some really valid stuff that we did, particularly in terms of privacy, like not taking photos of celebrities, Johns, etc. I felt at one point, particularly when working for companies in relation to publications that were due about things like pollution or alleged poor practices in relation to workers, my feeling was, I'm on the wrong side here. I want to be working for the journalists who are trying to uncover corruption, and I want to be working for broadcasters who want to bring this to TV. And actually, when I was at Schillings, I worked against Channel 4, where I ended up working. So for me, on the defendant side, I think one of the really important things is to try and understand that industry and the creative industries, generally, how they work. So, for example, in the UK, trying to understand journalism and how the editorial process works. There's books like Andrew Marr has written a book called My Trade, which is all about being a journalist and how you write copy and how that whole process works. In the UK also, and it's actually one of our clients now, Goldhanger, they do a podcast called The Rest is Entertainment, and that is brilliant about Hollywood and how Hollywood works and how, film studios are going and following all these trends. So, for example, the new thing is, of course, YouTube. And in the UK, young people, 16 to 24-year-olds, they're all on YouTube. They don't watch linear television as much. So trying to understand how the industry works. There are, again, I can only talk to the UK, there are lots of work placements, kind of student placements that you can take up in these broadcasters and publishers where you can learn from their lawyers. And again, so I now mainly specialize in TV and film. It just happens to be my love, I think, and where I've kind of chosen to do most of my work. But editorial lawyers, for example, they are so quick. You can get an article, you can very quickly say that's fine, you can publish, or you need to take this out. They'll understand the libel concerns. And for me, working in TV, amazing TV lawyers, there's not a huge amount of us in the world at the moment, but you can watch a film and very quickly learn what you need to do in order to safely publish.
So you mentioned moving from, how did you make the switch from being on the plaintiff side defending the celebrities to going to work for Channel 4? Was that, and it would seem to me that, having been the enemy, that it wouldn't be the easiest thing in the world to convince Channel 4 that they should bring you along. How did that work?
Well, again, it's a niche area of law. So to find a lawyer who's a former litigator who's got experience in TV, there's not a huge amount of lawyers in the UK who do that sort of work. And I had at Schillings, as I say, represented a client against Channel 4. They have an amazing sort of investigative reporting series called Dispatches, and often they are uncovering corruption or doing sort of secret filming investigations, doorstepping, that sort of thing. And it was really useful to them that I'd worked on the other side. I could sort of sense where the lines are. You know, you can quite quickly as a media lawyer read a script and sense where the danger is going to be and how you can kind of safely navigate the line. So that's quite a useful thing. And also just from speaking, having conversations to people in broadcasting, understanding the importance of editorial and the commissioning editors, you know, that they don't, and Channel 4 is a very special place. They broadcast some really challenging content. They don't necessarily want lawyers who are going to march in and say you can't do X, Y, and Z. What they really want is lawyers who will understand someone's creative vision and the amazing editorial by the creatives, and someone who is, rather than kind of coming in and saying, no, you can't do that, really going to try and understand it and work out how you can get it made. And that might be changing certain things or doing some edits and having a really kind of positive, and, you know, very rarely would you say no. You would always be trying to find how you can do something in a way that will stop you getting sued.
Yeah, very early on in my in-house career, I remember having a client say, I'm not asking you to tell me what I can't do. I'm asking you to tell me how to do what I want to do safely. And, you know, sometimes it would be so, you know, far afield that you'd be like, I'm sorry, I get that, but this is a no. But that was really rare.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And, you know, I think as well, it's often just taking the time to understand what people are trying to do. You know, I often give my advice as a kind of point for discussion, and we can talk about it. And sometimes when I talk to a creative and they explain their vision, explain what they're trying to do, explain why this narrative is important, and you can see there's a public interest justification, or you can understand the editorial relevance of what you're saying, then you can kind of, you know, meander. And at the end of the day, lawyers also, we just advise. It's the commissioners who decide. So it might be that you say, there's a risk here, you might get sued. But if it's important and there's a, you know, they feel strongly they want to show it, that's again for them to make that decision.
So it sounds like, I mean, one of the questions we wrote in the outline was, how did you develop your expertise in media law? It sounds like it happened over the course of many years and started in your pro bono work when you were at A&O. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think there are different genres in, I'm going to use TV and film again.
Right.
So it's a very different thing to go and legal a live comedy panel, you know, a comedy show. You know, you've got to think on your feet. You're looking at copyright. Or, you know, is someone humming a tune? Is someone said a joke that's borderline libelous? You know, all these things are very quick. And then
Isn't pretty much everything Jimmy Carr says borderline libelous?
Yes. And harm and offense rules. So Jimmy Carr, I once legaled a whole comedy show he'd done where the whole point of it was he was trying to be more and more offensive because he was seeing where people were going to stop laughing. You know, and we have harm and offense rules which say you can't, you know, you shouldn't be offending people. So, but unless it's editorially justified, and of course, if you set it up as, I am trying to see where the line of offense is, you know, that's excellent editorial justification to push boundaries. So, you know, and it's, you know as well what you can show at 8 p.m. and what you can show at 10 p.m. and, you know, what, you know, in a news piece, what could you show in terms of a traumatic event, you know, all that kind of stuff. So every kind of genre you need to know. So at the moment, there's lots and lots of kind of historical dramas. So I've just been watching Love Story, you know, about JFK Jr. And, you know, there's people like Daryl Hannah in that, you know, and that's a whole area that you need to have experience of working on these programs to understand how they work and, again, where the risk factors are. Similarly, documentaries is one of my favorite areas. And that's a whole other area when you're doing a documentary, for example, I did one on teenagers who were self-harming, and really important public interest justification in highlighting these issues and showing what to look for. And you had parents talking about, you know, the fact they couldn't recognize this. So really important documentary. And there you're advising a lot on duty of care and the welfare of your contributors, because at the end of the day, it's just a TV program really, but their lives go on. So again, you just need to work in all these spaces, work with children and see the issues there, work with animals. And one of the things that we always used to joke about was that you could have a program on modern slavery, for example. And in that program, there would be a dog chained up and you would get 100 complaints about the dog, you know. So I learned very quickly, any animal in your program, you know, make sure you've got welfare protocols, make sure you've got someone on set, you know, make sure that you've got your complaint response ready. So again, it's just from, you know, years of working in the industry that you begin to see where the lines are. And I mean, there's always something new, you know, every program there's something new, and then but I think, I mean, one thing that's important for me is I have no pride in saying, I'm going to double check this, or I want a second opinion on this. And I would hope that everyone else is the same, even a kind of seasoned person who, you know, has been doing it for years. There is often something that comes across that you haven't done or you haven't had experience in. And I really believe in kind of sharing that knowledge, and have no, you know, wouldn't mind at all to say to a client, do you know what, I'd like to check it with this person who's done more of this than I have.
You know, we talked a little bit in the outline about transitioning from having a bunch of different clients to having one client. But it sounds like at Channel 4, and it was my experience at a lot of the different places I worked, well, it felt like you had one client. You really had 50. They just happened to be all coming up through the same, you know, organization. Was that the same for you at Channel? Probably more so at Channel 4. I mean, could you also just explain for Americans what Channel 4 is? Because it just sounds like a place on the dial, and it's quite a bit more than that.
So I was trying to think what the equivalent could be in the US. I don't know. The PBS and Hulu were the only two that I could think of. But effectively, it's a public service broadcaster. So it's kind of government controlled and owned, but it's paid for by businesses, so by advertising. And it also has an online presence as well. But its remit is to use innovative programming, often that showcases voices or diverse voices that don't normally get mainstream attention. So it often highlights really important films about, people who aren't in the mainstream, you know, who have maybe disabilities or diversity in terms of class and in terms of race. So it has a really important remit to kind of often break new ground, do things that can be a bit shocking. It also has a lot of reality, or had a lot of reality TV shows like Married at First Sight, Big Brother. You know, these are all, so it's entertaining and innovative and challenging as well.
I would love to ask a question about the reality TV. I think this would be interesting for a lot of students, including myself, as it's the middle of the summer and everyone's deeply engaged in Love Island right now. Would you talk a little bit about like what you would do, what kind of expertise you would offer to a reality TV franchise like that?
Sure. That's a really good question. And I think, I mean, I'm grateful that all the broadcasters and production companies that I've worked with take duty of care really seriously and, you know, really put it at the heart of everything they do. So in the UK, you have Ofcom, which is the regulatory decision makers who kind of oversee the TV sector. And a few years ago, there was a spate of really unfortunate incidents, some of which related to contributors who were in Love Island. And there was some suicides and, you know, really, really sort of shocking things happened. And at the same time, the public became more and more concerned about reality shows and the effect on contributors. So Ofcom changed the rules because previously the welfare rules related only to children, but now we have clear rules which say that contributors who take part in shows should not be, physical and mental well-being shouldn't be jeopardized by their inclusion in a show. So you might have heard we say duty of care protocols or duty of care rules. They are really there to just make sure that the people taking part in programs are robust enough to take part in them, as far as you can tell. And of course, you can't vet out every risk, but you can check what medication someone's on, what mental health concerns they might have, what family support they have around them. Have they thought about what's going to happen to them? And obviously, what we can't control is what happens with social media. You know, somebody's on a show and people just dislike them and they can be trolled and they can have a horrific time dealing with that. So you've got to consider all that. You need people who understand what's going to happen, understand what the negative things that can happen and are ready for it. And then you also need to work out what you're going to do if something goes wrong, which unfortunately it does, you know. somebody is filming and they get really drunk and something bad happens, someone has a huge fight, or after filming something bad happens, there's a fallout or there's something on social media, and the job of the lawyer alongside the production company and the broadcaster is to work out how you properly support that person. And it's not just during filming, it's during broadcast. And it can be as simple as, do they have someone with them when they're watching it? And what happens afterwards? How do you support someone who's getting absolutely trashed in the press? So this is all, it's a huge responsibility, and I think everyone feels that quite deeply.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
So after, about 8 years at Channel 4, you and your husband, who's a chef, right?
Yeah.
Made the big move from London to near the Blackdown Hills and the Jurassic coast of Devon, one of the most beautiful places on earth. So I'm jealous. I was going to ask you, what was it like starting a hospitality and food business right before COVID? But having done that myself, it was pretty bad, wasn't it?
Yeah, we were not expecting that. So my husband, I met him when I was at Channel 4, or just before I got the job at Channel 4, and I had actually been single at the time when I booked a flight to Argentina. So I went to Argentina and I fell in love with asado cooking, and I went to a restaurant run by a guy called Francis Malman, who's this amazing asado chef, and I bought this book, Seven Fires. So I brought this to my new boyfriend, and anyway, 7 years later, we had this idea of basically moving and setting up a cookery school, an outdoor woodland cookery school. And we were in a small house in London with a tiny garden. We had 3 kids. And, I think we both wanted a bit of an adventure and to do something completely different. I knew that I could do freelance work. I mean, I sit most days with my headphones on watching TV. And I always thought I could do this anywhere. And so, we left London with our kids. We sold a very small 3-bedroom house and we bought a 6-bed small holding with 3 acres. And I have chickens walking outside the window, and we have dogs. And the idea was to set up an outdoor cookery school. And I was going to retrain as a psychotherapist, which was a bit of a curveball. But actually, I think psychology and law, you have that same analytical brain that you need. So it seemed like a good idea. But 6 months in, we got locked down with COVID, which actually, in a way, worked quite well for us because Luke started working for a couple of barbecue brands. At the time, Big Green Egg and then Kamado Joe. So we effectively got a load of barbecues sent to us and a load of meat. And Luke's job was to cook and do how-to videos online, which was great. But at that point, we then had the cost of living crisis and raising food prices. And so I then started freelancing, and that's where my career sort of took off in that direction.
Great. Phoebe, take it away. I think we've got to Reviewed and Cleared now, which you were very interested in.
Let me know if the feedback with my mic continues to be an issue. I'm wondering if it's because I'm wearing AirPods, but thank you very much for answering the question about the reality TV. I thought that was super interesting. And also I agree about what you said about psychology and the law. I was a psychology major in undergrad. So knowing that we've talked a little bit about the reality TV stuff, what else did you do at Reviewed and Cleared, and how was it different from Channel 4?
So Reviewed and Cleared is effectively a boutique media law firm with freelancers. So we're all kind of sitting around the country in our various sheds and home offices. And we work for broadcasters and film producers, but also production companies. So it was kind of different from working at Channel 4, where you're just advising the broadcaster, and effectively the production companies are being commissioned to bring programs that you're then advising on for the broadcaster. This way, I'm advising the production companies, and I still do the same today. So I'm advising various different producers and all different genres. So from I still do reality TV, I do documentaries, investigative journalism, live shows. You kind of follow the trends. So a new kind of trend is live streaming of concerts. So that's a new sort of area that we're doing at the moment, a huge amount of podcasts and vodcasts. So people are trying to get on YouTube. Shows are being filmed as podcasts and then being broadcast on TV. So it's really working through the whole gamut of that sort of area.
And do you have a favorite of any of those different genres or areas to work on?
And I like working on more. I've started working more and more on historic dramas or factual dramas, which I think is really interesting to understand what actually happened. And then how you're going to dramatize that in a way that is exciting and interesting to the viewer, but also understanding how you can, do that without libeling someone who's still alive. That's quite difficult and interesting. Investigative journalism is fascinating and probably the most kind of litigious stuff that you're doing, because you really have to get involved in the evidence and go through a script line by line and check that you can evidence and verify everything that you're saying. I think one of my loves is documentaries. I like duty of care, might be my interest in psychology as well. I like advising on kind of looking after contributors. And I like equally kind of high and lowbrow entertainment. I love entertainment and I love formats, and I can be watching various different things at a time. So, yeah, I wouldn't say I have a particular area that I love. It's nice to have a bit of a mix of different things. Lots of true crime as well, I should say.
Yeah, true crime's a big one for sure, especially in the podcast community. How did you adapt to working remotely? COVID, reviewed and cleared. I know that was something we all had to transition into, but...
Yeah, as I say, when I was at Channel 4 and I started working in TV and I had headphones on for 90% of my day, I remember thinking, this is, I could be anywhere to do this. I think being a junior lawyer, actually listening to conversations around you was really important. So I think if I had been more junior, I would have really struggled, because one of the ways in which you learn, I think, on the job is to listen to the partner in your office talking to a client on the phone, or listen to how your colleague is advising someone, or chat to people next to you. But I also read something. So I was fairly senior by the time I was sort of freelancing. I knew what I was doing. But I still, will pick up the phone to someone and call them and say, can you give me a second opinion on this? Or this is what I'm thinking about this. What do you think? But I also read somewhere about how working remotely was great for the world's introverts. And actually, I'm probably someone who is great with clients one-to-one. I've always had great relationships with clients, but maybe I'm not the loudest voice in a meeting. And I think I loved it, actually. I loved being able to sort of control my time and not have any office politics or anything like that, and just focus on the job and the work itself. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it, actually.
So then about 6 months ago, right, you went from reviewed and cleared to ClearDraft, which sounds like it's the same type of business, but now you've got an AI buddy with you in the business. So
yeah,
tell us about ClearDraft and what the bespoke AI model is, to the extent you can.
Yeah. So the two CEOs of ClearDraft, one, David Burgess, actually set up and founded Reviewed and Cleared, and one, Alex Wade, was the CEO of Reviewed and Cleared, the then CEO when I was there. And they had both had an idea with another founder, thinking, well, some of this stuff is real pattern spotting and just spotting risk. And once you know the rules, surely we can automate this, and had an idea about creating an AI product. They then found tech developers from a company called Yeti, who are in San Francisco, and came up with this idea and created a proof of concept. And so as the tech developers built it, David and Alex then drafted hundreds of articles and ran it through the product. And then I think one day the product came up with an answer, and they both looked at this and thought the other person had written it. But when they realized that this was actually what the product had come up with in terms of the analysis of risk, they realized, this is going to be huge. And the developers also thought the same and are now inside the company. They're on the board and investing as well. So they approached me to work in the TV side. And for me as well, having been freelance for 7 years, whereas there are certain things that always a human can advise on, and I'll talk about that in a sec, where there's always a human in the loop in this, there is a lot of churn, I would say, a lot of sort of repetitive work that you're doing, which I don't think needs a lot of. You just need to spot the rules. And so to me, it just made a huge amount of sense that this is a product which can look for a needle in a haystack. It sort of picks out using a kind of magnet-like AI system. It picks out those risks, it flags them, and then the lawyer can have a look at it. And actually, nowadays, there is so much content coming out, so many creators in their bedrooms. YouTube is a huge thing. There is so much content out there, but there is also so much risk. You see the amount of claims that are coming in, from politicians on both sides of the pond against creators. And there's only so many human lawyers who can do this work. And we all want instant comment. We all want, something happens, we all want to listen to a podcast. So I could just see the importance of it, really.
So how has it changed what you do every day? I mean, it sounds like it's taking some of the drudgery out of it. And I guess I have two questions. Like, how has it changed your work? And for junior lawyers who aren't going to have that same drudgery to learn from, how do you see them developing the expertise with the advent of AI models? There's a lot in there, but... No. Well,
I'm definitely not a tech expert, but I can explain sort of layman's terms what the product is, if maybe that helps a little bit. And obviously we have a chief product officer and other people who are developers in our company who may be rolling their eyes right now, but effectively we have the content which has potential problems in it. And then we have created, where we really very much need junior lawyers, paralegals, to help build a sort of library, an encyclopedia of legal rules, and something called a RAG. So it's a retrieval augmented generation system, which has all these rules in it of the three things that we're currently looking at, which is libel, privacy, and contempt. But we also may add copyright, lots of other things. And you can then obviously drop in US rules, German rules, Austrian rules. So you need lots of junior lawyers to do that, to really understand what the rules are. That then interacts with an LLM, a large language model, which flags the risk. And it's got a multi-layered prompt system. So various different prompts that we as lawyers and junior lawyers have input into the system. The LLM then spots the flags, and it then goes back through the system, the library and the RAG, to double check it, and then you have the answer. So in terms of how I'm learning to work with it, we have some amazing clients, and I'm currently building the audio-visual product, but at the moment it works on written content. So it might be a script or a treatment or a transcript of a call or something like that. It will take that, ingest that content, and it will come up with a risk assessment. So flags, various flags. So we are then working, and it's getting quicker and quicker on how we then assess those flags. So it's incredibly accurate, which is fantastic. And we're constantly testing the accuracy. It's very, very fast. So it can read a book in about 2 minutes. And then it's how we format that and how we advise on those flags. So, the great thing about it is it can read the whole of a book, and then it can tell you right at the start that this person has died. So you don't have to worry about libel. Or it can read the context. So it understands that, for example, if you've got a script and someone has done a right to reply at the end of the script, it will understand that all the way through in terms of your risk flagging for libel. So it really is early days. And I think we all know this is the worst it's ever going to be. It's going to get better and better and better. And it gets, within 7 days, it's getting even better. And, we're constantly improving it. But that is what we as lawyers, I think, have to work out now, is how we work with it, how we improve. But the idea, certainly for us, I know that David and Alex have been in a meeting and they said, here's the redundancy squad. And we very much we're not the redundancy squad. That's not the point of it. The point is you are freeing up lawyers from this churn, which, just like you say, it's the boring stuff. You need the lawyers with experience to give their experience of politics and the commerciality of risk and, how the risk feels and, the rest of the market and all these kind of things. You need the lawyers to do that sort of stuff and free them up from this routine stuff while reducing costs and reducing time, which is great for all creators, which is brilliant. And I'd say for junior lawyers and law students, and, I think don't panic is the first thing. There are definitely... You need junior lawyers and, paralegals, and we're looking for paralegals and junior lawyers all the time to build this library, but also to work with us because we need to train as many people as possible to be able to work with the product. And I think the other thing that's exciting is you have this new role called a legal engineer. I don't know if you know what a legal engineer is. So we have a brilliant legal engineer. His name's James Vaughan Jones. He is way more technical than I am. He's a brilliant lawyer himself, but he also his job is to sit between the tech guys and the lawyers and translate for both people. So he knows how the law works. If the product is analyzing things in a certain way, his job is to understand that, take what we are saying about the product and improvements and refinements and translate that back to the developers and talk about how, the technical aspects of, changing the product, improving the product. So this whole area of legal engineering, I think, is going to be huge. And I would say in the next few years, if you like tech, if you're interested in AI, that is a brilliant area that I think is going to become bigger and bigger.
We just had the episode we just dropped a couple of days ago was with...
I listened to it, yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
And Suzanne Muller was talking about how if you want to put AI in your business, don't just give it everything to do. You have to choose. And it sounds like you were talking about, we're having it do privacy and libel and something else.
Yeah.
And, we didn't just throw everything at the AI and say, oh, here, you do all of our work and we'll see what comes out of it. You're checking as you go to make sure that it is, I don't know if learning is the right word, but I guess so.
Yeah. So there are really exciting things that we can add. And all the time we're thinking, you could automate this, you could automate that. And that is the aim, is that we can add, for example, copyright issues that can spot third-party material, in something. There are already a couple of products out there who deal with kind of standards issues, for example, but compliance is one area that we are looking at as well and adding to the RAG. And the RAG, it's such a useful tool because you can add things. You can think, areas like fair dealing, or in the US, fair use, which is where you can use someone else's copyright in the UK, it's critique and reviewing it. That sort of thing, it's really pattern spotting. And anything like that, which you think, this is just, once you know the rule and you're spotting it, something like that can be automated. But obviously we are starting with what's going to get you sued. What's the most important risk if you're a publisher or an editor? And it's already been inbuilt in the systems of a couple of massive multimedia organizations. And we're working with book publishers, for example, which is great. And the other thing I should say is that there's a real impetus here in relation to social justice, because we are all pro-publication lawyers. We all feel very strongly in the freedom of expression, and we want to help creators, we want to help broadcasters and publishers. There are lots of people who are journalists who have stories that they want to write, but they might not have the money for legal fees. And you can actually use the product without a human lawyer in that case. So it's a kind of, for your self-published authors, or, as a philanthropic mission, we're looking right now how we can work with journalists in certain fields where they might not have money for sort of legal support. Can they have something they can run through that will flag the risks, and then they can call a lawyer or not? So it's all very exciting.
I mean, it sounds like there's huge opportunities. Is there any nagging worry that you have about it, or many nagging worries that you have about it?
No, I mean, I think in my personal career, I think the move to Devon has been brilliant in terms of taking a risk, having an adventure, thinking outside the box, being entrepreneurial. And for me, when I found out what they were doing and the fact that this stuff could be automated, and I saw how it worked, straight away I thought our industry is going to be different in a year, and in 5 years it will be completely transformed. And for me, the important thing was I want to be involved right at the start. I want to be, one of the first members and helping transform this and really understanding it from the start, rather than it impacting my career and then working out how to get involved. So that was important to me. I mean, I think as a society, like everything, it's a huge change. It's a massive disruption. Of course, there are conversations that we all have to have. And I think we are very open to talking about, any sort of concerns people have and how to eradicate them. One thing I would say is, people always worry with legal AI about hallucinated cases. And of course, at the moment, it's all over the news. Someone has ChatGPT goes to court and mentions a case that,
doesn't exist.
but our product is not generative. So it will never, it uses our RAG and it uses that to interpret the risk. It won't come up with some random case that didn't exist, which is good.
It's entirely source-based?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not generative at all.
Well, and the lawyers who cite a case that doesn't exist, I'm like, if that's our biggest worry,
yeah.
Just like, go read the case. I mean, I've never appeared in court citing a case that I hadn't read.
Yeah.
I mean, who does that? I understand people are busy and they want to go fast and they got a million things going, but just, if you're going to stand up in front of somebody in a black robe and tell them that this is what happened somewhere, you really ought to know that it did.
Yeah. And I think that, change is scary, and things are changing at such a rapid pace. But I think some of the headlines in relation to AI, they are kind of clickbait, risky. So for example, another example is I know a therapist who said that LLMs are now acting as a sort of better than a mediocre counselor, basically. And you can think of the possibilities of that to people that in their pocket, they have someone who can support them and provide empathy and show concern if they're lonely or help them solve an argument with their family. Whereas, the headlines might focus on a case where something, happened that is unfortunate. And I think we should all, I'm optimistic about it. And, I have a teenage son who I have to speak to him as well when he sort of has concerns about, society and AI. And I think we all, there are conversations that we all have to have. But for me, it's exciting and the possibilities are great.
Yeah, I worry, I guess, for the generation of teenagers that we had human friends.
Yeah.
We didn't talk to machine friends, and we knew. So when we interact with a machine, it's with a base knowledge of interacting with humans. And I think for a lot of, young people, they've grown up interacting with a machine in a way that we never did because you couldn't talk to your typewriter. It didn't talk back, you know?
But I think that the things that I focus on when I think about things like that is I think humans have an amazing survival instinct and an instinct to connect with each other. That's why live events, for example, are huge now. People want to go to a live event and see live music. There's a massive nostalgia for 90s music. I'm going to see Alanis Morissette on next Friday. Live events and sort of having ways to connect are becoming more and more important. Similarly, I think our product in terms of law is fantastic in terms of to help creators, but I think people like the storytellers are going to become more important because, there is AI in the creative industries, but I think, most of us and us as well worry about that. And we don't want to see generative AI writing books or, it can be very useful in certain aspects of creativity, but I think storytelling will become important because it is human and it is how we all connect. Similarly, seeing each other in real life is going to become important. So I think all those kind of leisure things where you get together, cafes and co-working spaces and cinemas and all these kind of things are going to become even more and more important. And that's interesting too.
Yeah. So you mentioned live events again when you were talking earlier about being the lawyer on a live event.
Yeah.
What do you do as the lawyer on a live event? Just go, oh, then what?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. One of my colleagues is going to see a concert this weekend, which is being live streamed. I've done a lot of live events. So I think, first of all, obviously you look at the normal risk. Someone says something libelous, this person did X, Y, and Z. At that point, your presenter, if you've got a presenter, can apologize or potentially you have an Aston or potentially you come back to after the break and say, sorry for this thing. And you distance yourself and say that's their opinion, it's not verified or something. Right. Obviously, swear, strong language before the watershed. That's an obvious one where you apologize straight away. Then you can edit it, obviously, from, online repeats and you can edit it from social media. You had, at Glastonbury last year, which is a big music concert. There was a couple of people on stage who made offensive comments about, I think there was one sort of punk act who made an offensive comment. That was live streamed. You can't really do anything to stop that, but you can make an edit. You can get the broadcaster to make an apology. crisis management. There could be a terrorist attack. There could be any number of things.
Right.
Another example would be a live kind of panel show, and you've got someone who is a guest who works for the company, and they start promoting that product. So they start saying, oh, this, I love this thing, it's brilliant, it really helps me in my life. And at that point you need a lawyer really to say, hang on, that's promotional, you need to stop them, move them onwards. So normally you need to be all kind of able to think on your feet and able to talk. You could have a contempt position, somebody says someone's guilty, in an active proceedings, that's really serious. So
right.
There's lots and lots we could do. We've just drafted some brilliant protocols, and it's actually from thinking, well, what could happen in a concert? You start thinking, actually, we've got a 20-page protocol now. So, yeah.
Cool. Phoebe, do you have more questions?
I don't off the top of my head. This is all very interesting, though. Like, I'm loving hearing this. The live event. I mean, what's the craziest thing? You probably can't talk about it. Does a lot of crazy stuff happen at live events?
Well, I think one of my first live events that I went to legal, it was quite a famous comedian came up to me straight away, and I just started at Channel 4, and he asked me if he could say this one joke, and it had a possible libel, but it was one of these things that was borderline, and so I found myself advising, a very famous comedian about whether he could or couldn't say this joke, and how can you suggest to a comedian what he should say, on the punchline? Another one is going to an event where it's like a presenter situation where you have to do a legal and compliance briefing to someone who has done a lot of TV. But unfortunately, it's just one of these things for your insurance. You might have to show that you've, gone over the risks. So you're in a dressing room with someone getting their makeup who's eye rolling while you explain what the main libel concerns might be. But yeah, it's all really, I think, as the lawyer, you're often the most boring person in the room, unfortunately, but it's a real joy to work with such creative people and, people who really deeply care about what they're doing and, really, think about the editorial, think about the narrative of their program. And, it's really exciting to work with people like that.
I can absolutely agree. That sounds fantastic. I think we already kind of talk about how, like, advice that you would give to students who are interested in working in entertainment or media law, but how would you suggest, like, breaking into that? Because I feel like with it as a niche, UC Law has an entertainment and law, or entertainment and sport law society, but it focuses heavy on the sport. So there's not a lot of entertainment law opportunity here, at least. So how would you suggest, like, breaking into that area?
It is a niche area. So, the same as the UK. I know the law firms in the US that I work with, some brilliant lawyers who, often if you've got a program that's going to be broadcast both in the UK and the US, they will need both types of laws. So they'll need a legal opinion from a US counsel as well. And I know who I will use across the US. Typically, like the UK, it's a very niche area. So there's a very small amount of lawyers who will do that kind of thing. But as I say, with more and more content coming out, I do feel like it's a growing area and we need more lawyers. And so I would say I'm absolutely happy if anyone wants to approach me and I can suggest some people that you might want to contact. But I think, as I say, trying to get work experience for these niche firms, if they're near you, getting involved with your local broadcaster or radio station or newspaper, because they probably have lawyers or they, just even working there and seeing what they do to understand where you could be advising on risk might be helpful. But yeah, as I say, I think with such a litigious environment, it's in the news all the time about various sort of lawsuits that have been taken out, not least Trump suing the BBC. I think it is going to be a growing area and something that could be of interest. And there's some brilliant lawyers in the US as well.
Fantastic. Sara, thanks so much for your help. I really enjoyed seeing you again. Let's try not to wait another 15 years before we catch up again. But this has been a lot of fun, and I'm glad we were able to make the time.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.